Her son handed her a maid's uniform on Mother's Day. Margaret Ellis, 71, didn't blink. Nathan, the boy she'd raised and bankrolled, smirked like it was a joke worth framing. By summer's end, half his multi-million-dollar home would be on the market. Her half. She'd spent decades building his foundation. Now she was pulling out the ground beneath him. And when buyers came knocking, she'd be the one holding the keys. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Margaret Ellis parked her car with quiet precision at the far end of the sweeping driveway, just beneath the dappled shade of a crepe myrtle. Nathan's house loomed in the mid-morning sun, an angular, white-bricked monument to everything he'd convinced himself he deserved. The landscaping was immaculate, every hedge trimmed like a military haircut. Even the wind chimes on the porch seemed intentional, designed not for sound but for status. She took a breath, one hand still on the steering wheel. It was Mother's Day, and Nathan had insisted, almost demanded, that she come to brunch. Family tradition, he'd said. The invitation had felt less like a request and more like a summons, dressed up in obligation and self-congratulation. Still, Margaret had agreed. Sometimes, silence takes its time to gather its voice. The front door swung open before she reached the steps. Nathan stood in the doorway, teeth gleaming, arms wide as if he'd just been voted mayor of his own mansion. "There she is," he said with theatrical enthusiasm. "The woman of the hour." Margaret offered a cool smile, one she had perfected over decades of keeping other people's households in order. She stepped inside, where the air was crisp with lavender diffusers and faintly masked tension. The walls were clean white, punctuated by oversized art meant to look expensive. From the kitchen, she could hear Charlotte directing a caterer with the forced warmth of someone auditioning for charm. "Happy Mother's Day, Margaret," Charlotte called, gliding over in nude pumps and a champagne-colored shift dress. "You look so elegant today." "I wore what I had," Margaret replied simply. Paige appeared near the kitchen island, her shoulders slightly hunched, her eyes catching Margaret's with something like quiet urgency. The girl gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, an attempt at solidarity. Before she could move further into the house, Nathan clapped his hands together and gestured toward a silver-edged gift box resting on the sideboard. "Before we dig into brunch," he said, "I wanted to give you something special, thoughtful, a little trip down memory lane." Charlotte chuckled softly, resting her hand on Nathan's arm. "Oh, he's been so proud of this one. Open it, please." Margaret approached the box slowly, the air thick with anticipation that felt just slightly off. She removed the lid, and for a moment, her eyes didn't register the contents. Then they did. Folded with careful precision was a crisp black maid's uniform, the kind with starched edges and a white apron laid over the top like punctuation. Resting on the neckline was a small cream-colored note card. The handwriting was unmistakably Nathan's, flourished, bold, as if he were signing an autograph instead of insulting a legacy. "Back to your roots," it read. No one spoke for a beat too long. Charlotte made a light, nervous sound that passed for laughter. "Nathan's humor is, well, you know, he's always teasing." Nathan raised his eyebrows expectantly, as if he were waiting for applause. "Come on, it's a joke. You've got to admit, it's a little funny." Margaret looked down at the uniform again, then at her son, then at Charlotte. Her expression didn't harden. It didn't crack either. It simply cooled, like the surface of a lake icing over in real time. Across the room, Paige mouthed a silent message. "I'm sorry." Margaret placed the lid back onto the box slowly and with the same care one might use to seal a wound. "Thank you for brunch," she said, her voice calm and unhurried. "It looks lovely." Then she turned, walking with complete control toward the door, her heels tapping softly against the imported tile as if marking the rhythm of her departure. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. "Mom?" Nathan called after her, his voice slightly higher now, the confidence starting to buckle. "Are you really leaving?" She didn't answer. She reached her car, slid into the seat, and closed the door with a deliberate motion that sent no echo, just finality. As she backed out of the driveway and turned toward the road that would take her back to her side of town, she didn't look in the rearview mirror. There was no point. The past was no longer behind her. Inside her purse, her phone buzzed. A text from Nathan, no doubt. She ignored it and instead reached for her address book, the kind still bound in leather. With a fingertip worn by work but steady as ever, she flipped to a number she hadn't dialed in years. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. George Withers speaking. Margaret adjusted her grip on the wheel and said, without pause, "George, I'd like to talk about selling a house." Margaret stood at the edge of her backyard, where the grass had gone uneven from summer heat and low ambition. A few stubborn daffodils she hadn't planted kept pushing up between the fence posts. She hadn't touched them. Some things insist on blooming even when forgotten. She set her coffee on the splintered railing of the porch and exhaled a long breath through her nose. Not in anger, not even in regret, just memory. This house, her house, wasn't much to look at from the street. It had no polished brass fixtures or symmetrical boxwoods, no hand-laid stone driveways or curated mailboxes, but the deed bore only her name, and every nail and brick inside it had been paid for with her body, her back, her knees, her lungs. She had earned the quiet here. She walked inside, poured herself the rest of the lukewarm coffee, and carried it to the small table by the kitchen window. The early sunlight cut across her hardwood floors, catching on dust and scars in the wood like lines in a well-read book. The Maid uniform Nathan had gifted her still sat folded in the trunk of her car, untouched since she'd driven away. She hadn't decided what to do with it. She supposed there'd be time for that later. On the table sat a manila envelope she'd pulled from a filing cabinet earlier that morning. It held the original mortgage documents from Nathan's house, her initials scrawled next to his on page after page of legalese, the down payment check stub still neatly paper-clipped inside. Her husband Frank had signed too. He'd passed 4 years ago, but his name remained in ink, steady and present, like he was watching from just beyond the margins. They had co-signed, they had co-funded, they had, for all intents and purposes, built the foundation beneath Nathan's mansion. And when Frank died, Margaret never bothered to take her name off the title. She hadn't seen the point, until now. She pulled out her phone and dialed George. "I thought I might hear from you again this morning," George said, his voice low and dry with that worn southern lilt she trusted more than most gospel sermons. "I need to know for sure," she said. "Am I still on that deed?" "I already pulled it." She could hear the shuffle of papers on his end. "You're listed as a joint owner, 50%, no caveats, no time limitations. It's airtight." She pressed the phone closer to her ear, even though she'd heard exactly what she wanted. "So there's no dispute?" "None. If you want to sell your share, Margaret, no one can stop you. Not legally." Margaret stood slowly and walked back to the porch, the floorboards creaking beneath her step. The sun was higher now, and the neighborhood dogs had started their usual barking match across the fences. She felt none of it, just a steady, rising clarity. "Good," she said quietly, "because I have a sale to prepare." A door opened next door, and Helen Briggs stepped onto her own porch, wearing her gardening apron and holding a coffee mug that read, "Leave me alone. I'm blooming." She spotted Margaret and raised her eyebrows in a silent question. "Got a minute?" Margaret called over. Helen crossed the lawn in under 30 seconds, her knees creaking more than she'd admit, but her energy sharp as ever. She sat beside Margaret on the porch swing, set her mug on the armrest, and waited. "I'm selling my share of Nathan's house," Margaret said without preamble. Helen blinked, lips parting. "You're what?" "I'm still on the title. Frank and I never removed me. I helped pay for that place, Helen. I gave him roots, and he threw them back in my face tied up in polyester and a bow." Helen took a long sip from her mug, then placed it down with a quiet clink. "Are you sure this isn't too much?" Margaret's eyes didn't waver. "Number it's exactly enough." A breeze stirred the porch, bringing with it the faintest scent of cut grass and salt from the marsh a few miles off. Margaret closed her eyes briefly and breathed it in. The text came just after noon. "Hope you liked your gift. It was a joke. Lighten up." Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, the screen glowing in the palm of her hand as if it were daring her to react. The words felt small, flimsy, like they were trying to float above what they'd done. She read it once, then again, then tapped the side button and locked the phone without typing a single letter in return. She hadn't decided yet what Nathan would deserve from her in the end, but she was clear now on what he didn't. A reply. Outside, a car idled quietly by the curb. A white Ford Explorer with no decals, no logos, just a small magnetic sign on the door, Low Country Premier Appraisals. The man who stepped out wore a navy polo and khakis, his clipboard tucked beneath one arm, and a practiced neutral expression on his face. Margaret met him halfway down the driveway. "Mrs. Dalton?" he asked politely. She gave a faint smile and offered her hand. "Ms. Dalton, yes, thanks for coming." That name had been her mother's. She used it now the way some people used tinted windows, not to hide, but to limit who could see clearly. He nodded and glanced at the folder she handed him, tax records, photos, square footage specs, and then up at the house. "Do you need interior access today?" she asked. "No, ma'am. Public records and curb appeal will get me close. We can schedule interior walkthrough later if you move forward." She watched him work from the porch, jotting numbers and snapping discreet photos from the sidewalk. He moved with quiet focus, not the kind that asked questions, and she appreciated that more than he would ever know. By the time he got back in his car and gave her a short nod, no small talk, no lingering, Margaret already knew. The house was worth more than Nathan had ever told her, likely well into 8 figures now, with the recent coastal rezoning and Charlotte's endless renovations, and half of it, without dispute, belonged to the woman he'd dressed up as his own punchline. Inside, Margaret sat down at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. She navigated to a secure email account George had helped her set up years ago, back when they were still sorting out Frank's estate. The name on the inbox wasn't hers. It belonged to Elm Shore Holdings, LLC, a quiet legal shell she'd opened in 2019 when the idea of protecting assets had seemed more like a chore than a plan. Now it felt like armor. An email from George waited at the top of her inbox. Subject: Preliminary documents, sale preparation. She opened it, scanned the attached files, and nodded to herself. George worked like a surgeon, methodical, bloodless, and always 5 steps ahead. He'd already begun drafting the language for a potential sale. Margaret reviewed each page slowly, absorbing the details. The paperwork moved through legal clauses like a quiet declaration of war. She didn't feel triumphant, not yet, just grounded. Every step she took now was a step away from who she'd allowed him to become in her presence. She rose from the table and wandered to the back door, pushing it open just enough to let the smell of jasmine and salt air drift in. The porch boards were still warm from the morning sun. Somewhere down the block, Helen's wind chime gave a single metallic ting before falling silent again. Her phone buzzed once more. Not a message this time, just a notification from social media. Paige had once set up an account for her and forgotten to log out. Margaret picked up the phone and saw the post at the top of the feed. Charlotte Ellis. Blessed to build generational wealth together. Legacy. Haas family first. Beneath the caption was a filtered photo of Nathan, Charlotte, and Paige standing in front of their house. Her house, smiling like nothing had ever cracked the surface. Margaret stared at the screen until her thumb moved without her quite willing it to. She took a screenshot, filed it away, and whispered, "Let's see how she likes generational liquidation." The dining room in Nathan's house was built for spectacle, walls paneled in mahogany veneer, a glass chandelier dripping crystals like melting ice, and a table long enough to seat a boardroom. But that night it held only 5 people, Nathan at the head, Charlotte at his right, Margaret at the far end, and Paige between them like a neutral zone. The food was elaborate, but untouched. Imported sea bass, grilled artichokes, some risotto that Margaret was certain came from a recipe Charlotte had never actually cooked herself. The air smelled faintly of lemon and wine, but something sour lay beneath it, unspoken, metallic. Charlotte took a small sip from her Pinot Grigio and dabbed the corner of her lip with a cloth napkin before speaking. "We've been thinking about adding a pool cabana this summer, maybe with a little wet bar. Nothing extravagant," she said with a dismissive wave, "but it just feels like the property's begging for one. The value's so stable right now. Margaret nodded slowly, her fingers lightly resting around the stem of her water glass. She didn't drink alcohol at their table anymore. She preferred to keep her senses sharp. "That sounds ambitious," she said, tone even, neither impressed nor critical. Charlotte smiled, mistaking neutrality for approval. "It's just about using the space wisely, you know? Optimizing." Nathan leaned back in his chair and swirled his wine, one arm slung behind Charlotte's chair like he owned her too. "Or," he said, eyes gleaming, "we turn the maid's quarters into a nice little corner for Grandma. Keep her close, right?" The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like a fork scraping ceramic. Charlotte smiled politely, though even she seemed unsure whether to commit to the joke. Paige stared down at her plate, shoulders stiff. Margaret smiled too, a small and precise gesture. "Let me know if you ever need to move quickly," she said, her voice quiet but deliberate. "Sometimes opportunities come and go before you can grab a drink from that wet bar." Nathan blinked once, then covered it with a chuckle that landed just a beat too late. "Always with the quips, Mom." Charlotte set her napkin down and changed the subject to the Charleston garden tour she was co-chairing. Her voice flitted between sentences like a dragonfly skimming a pond, never staying long enough for anything to feel grounded. Margaret let the conversation drift over her. She nodded at the appropriate times, even offered a polite, "Sounds lovely," but she was elsewhere. She was remembering the feel of the property line documents George had couriered over that morning, the ones she now kept sealed in her handbag. She could practically hear the rustle of them as Charlotte spoke about azaleas. After dinner, while Nathan poured himself a scotch and Charlotte took a call from a friend, Paige slipped out to the back porch. Margaret found her leaning on the railing, arms crossed tight over her chest like she was bracing for a storm that hadn't arrived yet. "You okay?" Paige asked without turning. Margaret stood beside her, both of them facing the darkened backyard. The landscape lights had kicked on, casting soft halos over the flower beds and the too-perfect lawn. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain gurgled like a well-fed guest. "I'm better than I've ever been," Margaret said, and it wasn't a performance. It wasn't even a bluff. Paige finally turned her head, brows drawn together in a question she hadn't quite formed. Margaret smiled gently. "Sometimes better doesn't look how people expect it to, doesn't mean it isn't." They stood there a moment longer, silence falling like a warm shawl around their shoulders. It was late morning when Margaret arrived at the Ellis residence, escorted by nothing more than the quiet hum of a sedan and a breeze off the water. She didn't park in the driveway. Instead, she pulled into a spot near the curb under the shade of a magnolia and stepped out with the steady composure of someone not here to ask permission. Charlotte met her at the door, confusion stitched into every crease of her expression. "Margaret," she said, glancing at the phone in her hand, as though she must have missed a calendar alert. "Is everything all right?" "I scheduled a quick walk-through," Margaret replied evenly. "Won't be long. Thought it best to drop in while Nathan's at that investor thing." "Oh," Charlotte said, blinking. "A walkthrough of what, exactly?" Before Margaret could answer, the doorbell chimed. Behind her, a man in a slate-gray sport coat and aviators stepped forward from a black SUV, clipboard tucked against his chest. He looked efficient, unfazed and unfamiliar. "Mrs. Dalton?" he asked, nodding slightly. Margaret gestured toward him without breaking her gaze on Charlotte. "Buyer's agent. Local firm. Coastal Equity Group." Charlotte's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. "I let Nathan know you'd both been too busy to follow up on maintenance reports," Margaret added. "I figured it was time someone did." With the grace of someone accustomed to unlocking gates that didn't belong to them, the agent moved past them into the backyard, pulling out a measuring wheel and a folded plat map. He walked the perimeter slowly, eyes sweeping the foundation, the retaining wall, the back porch with its recent additions. Charlotte glanced toward the kitchen, then back at Margaret. "Is there something going on I should know about?" Margaret smiled gently. "Yes," she said, folding her hands in front of her. "But you'll hear about it when it's over." From the second-floor hallway, soft footsteps echoed. Paige appeared at the top of the stairs, barefoot and still in a hoodie, hair tied up loosely in a bun. She watched the scene unfold below like a child studying a chess game without knowing all the rules. She came down slowly and made her way out to the patio where Margaret stood watching the buyer's agent pace the fence line with quiet precision. Paige leaned in close. "Grandma," she whispered, "why are those people measuring the backyard?" Margaret kept her eyes on the man with the clipboard. "Just taking stock, sweetheart." "Of what?" "Of what I still own?" Paige blinked, brow furrowed. She looked between her grandmother and the agent and said nothing more, though something about her posture shifted, like a page had turned in her that she hadn't expected to read aloud. Inside, Charlotte's phone buzzed again. She picked it up, frowned, then walked briskly toward the front entry. Margaret could hear her whispering into it, trying to sound casual, but her voice had a jitter to it, like someone checking on a lock they weren't sure they'd clicked shut. The agent returned 10 minutes later, offered Margaret a short nod, and handed her a signed notepad sheet. "I'll email the full valuation tonight," he said, "but it's strong. Hot zone right now. Inventory's tight." "Appreciated," Margaret replied, sliding the paper into her handbag. "Ms. Ellis," Charlotte said suddenly, her voice stretched tight as fishing line, "I think Nathan should probably be part of this discussion. I'm not sure it's appropriate to—" Margaret turned to her with polite finality. "Charlotte, I didn't ask to come into your home today. I came into mine." Charlotte's jaw tightened just a breath. Paige stood frozen on the patio, watching both women. The official email went out at 10:03 a.m. sharp. Subject line, "Notice of intent to sell. 50% ownership interest, 117 Willow Sound Lane." George had drafted it clean, clinical, and exact. There were no flourishes, just facts, attached documents, and a note confirming that the sender was acting under power of attorney for Margaret Ellis, co-owner of the property. Beneath it sat a single line in George's voice. "I imagine you'll be hearing something soon." He wasn't wrong. The first ping came less than 10 minutes later. "Nathan," group text. "Mom, what is this?" Margaret saw it light up her screen just as she finished slicing an apple in the kitchen. She didn't respond. She continued arranging it on the plate beside 2 slices of cheddar and a small dish of almonds, Paige's favorite mid-afternoon snack whenever she stopped by after school. Another ping. "Charlotte," group text. "This can't be real." "Margaret, you're ruining everything over a joke?" Margaret set the plate down gently on the table, walked to the drawer beside the fridge, and pulled out a narrow linen envelope. Inside it, folded with deliberate care, was the maid uniform Nathan had gifted her, still pristine, still sealed in memory like a wound under gauze. She took out the small card that had come with it, the red script still cloying. "Back to your roots." She laid both items on the dining table, stepped back, and took a photo. No filters, no clever angle. Just the uniform, centered in the frame. The note tilted slightly at the edge, as if it were ashamed of itself. Then she sent it. "Margaret." Group text. "This is what I received. Now you've received yours." The thread went still. The 3 dots that signaled someone was typing appeared, then vanished, reappeared, disappeared again. Margaret set her phone face down and went out to the porch, where the sunlight warmed the wood and the wind carried the smell of salt and mown grass. She didn't need to check again. There was nothing left to say. By late evening, the group chat had gone completely silent. No explanations, no apologies. Not even Paige, who she knew had seen it all but wasn't ready to pick a side in a house where sides were landmines. 3 days passed. Nathan didn't call. Charlotte didn't email. No couriered letters, no lawyers knocking on the door, not even a social media quote about healing or boundaries. Just silence, echoing through the digital void like a scream swallowed midair. On the 4th morning, Helen showed up with a lemon loaf wrapped in wax paper and her eyes already narrowed. "I take it the text hit home," she said, setting the loaf on the counter and peeling off her gardening gloves. "They've been quiet," Margaret said, slicing the bread into 2 clean pieces. Helen snorted. "Quiet men always come back loud. Just means they're gathering their pitchforks." Margaret offered a thin smile. "They can sharpen them all they want. I've got the deed." Helen took a bite, chewed, and gestured toward the kitchen window with her fork. Did they really think you wouldn't push back? After everything? Margaret didn't answer immediately. She poured them both a cup of coffee, set one down beside the bread, and looked out the window toward the cluster of white rooftops across the harbor. Wealth perched on sand. I think they forgot who taught Nathan how to fight, she said finally. He's been swinging with both hands ever since he could walk, but one of them was always mine. The clouds had rolled in over Charleston by the time Paige knocked on the back door, not the kind that threatened real rain, just the low woolen kind that made everything feel quiet and heavier than it had any right to be. Margaret was already standing at the sink, drying a single saucer with the same deliberate care she gave to most things these days. She opened the door before Paige could knock twice. "Hey," the girl said, her voice subdued. Her hoodie sleeves were pushed past her wrists, and the corners of her mouth looked like they'd forgotten how to smile naturally. I just needed a minute away." "You have all the minutes you want here," Margaret replied gently. Without another word, she stepped aside and let her granddaughter in. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and clove, not because Margaret had baked anything, but because she'd simmered a pot of water with spice earlier that afternoon. It was an old trick she'd learned in the houses she used to clean, make a home smell like warmth even when it was empty. She had no use for artifice now, but the scent still comforted her. Margaret moved toward the stove, reached for a small saucepan, and began pouring milk into it without asking. Paige didn't need to request anything. Some rituals don't need language. "Hot chocolate?" Margaret asked, just to fill the space. Paige nodded. "Please." They stood in silence while the milk warmed. Margaret stirred slowly, adding a spoonful of cocoa powder and a pinch of salt, the way her mother had taught her. It wasn't the instant kind Charlotte bought in bulk from that boutique grocery store with the gold carts. This was the real thing, hand-whisked, rich, and meant to be savored. When it was ready, Margaret poured it into 2 ceramic mugs, mismatched, both chipped, and handed one to Paige. The girl wrapped her fingers around it like she needed it to warm more than just her hands. Margaret gestured toward the porch. "Let's sit." Outside, the breeze moved gently through the garden, brushing past the hedges and across the porch rails. The old swing creaked once as they settled into it side by side. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The mug was warm against Margaret's palms, and the horizon beyond the backyard seemed to stretch wider than it usually did. "Grandma," Paige said quietly, "can I ask you something without you pretending it doesn't hurt?" Margaret turned her head slightly. "Always." "Why would he do that?" Paige asked. "Why would Dad give you something like that uniform? What was he even trying to say?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She took a slow sip of the cocoa, then lowered the mug into her lap. Her eyes stayed fixed on the lawn, where the porch light had begun to cast a gentle golden arc near the base of the magnolia tree. "Because he forgot," she said finally. "He forgot what I built, what I gave, and who I am." Paige didn't interrupt. She only listened, head tilted slightly toward her grandmother, as if leaning in would help catch more than just words. "I scrubbed other people's baseboards so he could go to a better school," Margaret continued, her voice steady but not without weight. "I cleaned houses the size of that one across the marsh just to keep his world bigger than mine ever had the chance to be. I co-signed on his mortgage. I put money down when banks wouldn't lend him a dime, and then he gave me polyester shame in a box and thought I'd call it nostalgia." For a long moment, the only sound was the breeze threading itself through the porch slats. "You're selling the house, aren't you?" Paige asked softly, though it wasn't really a question. "I'm selling my silence," Margaret said, "and I've underpriced it for years." There was no bitterness in her tone, just truth, measured and full-bodied like a sentence that had taken too long to say. Paige set her mug down carefully on the small table beside them. "Will I still see you?" Margaret turned to face her fully then, her eyes softening. "Of course you will. My door's open whether that house closes or not, but I'll understand if it gets complicated." Paige looked down, pulling her sleeves over her hands. "It's already complicated. But you're the only person in that entire family who doesn't lie with a smile." They sat in silence for a while, the swing swaying gently beneath them. Then Paige's phone buzzed on the table. She ignored it at first, but after the second buzz, she flipped it over. Her eyes skimmed the screen, her mouth going tight. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Something I should see?" Paige turned the screen so her grandmother could read it. Text from Nathan. "I need to know if she's poisoning you against me." Margaret didn't flinch. She set her mug down and folded her hands slowly in her lap. "You can tell him no," she said. Paige nodded. "I will." Margaret looked her directly in the eye, her voice calm and firm. "Because I don't need to poison what's already rotting." The lobby of Withers and Hartwell was as quiet as a bank vault when Margaret walked in. The floors were slate, the walls a cool cream, and the receptionist greeted her with the clipped politeness reserved for old money or old power. Margaret, she supposed, was beginning to resemble both. She wore a navy blue wool coat, even though the day was already warm, and her hair was pulled back in a low, deliberate bun. She hadn't come to play a part, but she had come to be unmissable. George met her at the hallway with a nod, his reading glasses perched low on his nose and a manila folder clutched tightly in one hand. "He's already in there," George murmured. "Brought a lawyer. Young, loud tie. Big on posturing." Margaret gave a faint smile. "Good. Let's make sure he earns his invoice." The conference room was quiet when she stepped inside. Nathan was seated at the far end of the table, spine straight but not relaxed. The posture of someone trying to reclaim control without knowing where he'd lost it. His lawyer stood as she entered, extending a hand. "Ms. Ellis, David Crane, legal counsel for your son." She shook his hand with civility, then moved to the chair across from Nathan. George sat beside her, laying out the folder and sliding it open with the slow confidence of someone who knew the floor beneath him wouldn't crack. Nathan cleared his throat. "I don't know what this is about anymore," he said, his voice already starting to rise. "I mean, look, I get it. You're angry, but you're going to destroy my reputation if this goes public. You understand that, right?" Margaret took her time folding her coat over the back of her chair, smoothing the sleeves as she did. She looked at him squarely. "You shredded mine," she said, her voice firm and even, "the moment you gift-wrapped shame and called it tradition." Crane sat up straighter, already flipping through his binder. "There's no precedent for a forced sale of a primary residence, especially one under active family occupancy. We've reviewed South Carolina case law." George held up one finger without raising his voice. "Rayner vs. Rayner, 2011. Joint ownership dispute, family residence, half-owner filed for sale. Granted. Then again in Boone vs. Carter, 2017. Nearly identical structure. I'm happy to email you both." Crane blinked. Nathan sat back slowly, as if suddenly realizing that legal firepower only worked when you had the ground to stand on. "I don't want to fight you," he said. This is over a mistake." "No," Margaret replied. "It's over a pattern. But let's not pretend you weren't warned." George slid a clean sheet of paper across the table. "We're offering Nathan the right of first refusal," he explained, "to buy out Margaret's share, 50% of the current market value, plus interest adjusted over 10 years. It's generous given the level of equity involved." Nathan glanced down at the figure written at the bottom of the page. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. "You'd really do this?" he said, as though the truth still hadn't fully landed inside him. "You'd actually sell half the house out from under me?" Margaret reached into her bag and placed a single item on the table, a printed copy of the photo she'd sent in the group text. The Maid uniform. The note. "I didn't come here to ask permission, Nathan," she said. "I came here to offer you the first exit before the gate closes." Crane shifted in his chair, clearly sensing the air had changed. Nathan leaned forward, his voice thinner now. "You don't need the money." Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Number, but I needed the clarity." The courthouse was half empty the morning Nathan showed up with his attorney, David Crane, trying to fast-track a motion that had no legs but plenty of noise. The filing was labeled Request for Temporary Injunction, Family Distress and Property Disruption, and the language inside it was full of vague emotional appeals dressed up as legal concern. Irreparable familial damage. Preservation of legacy. Maternal instability. George didn't even bother to put on a tie for the hearing. He arrived with 2 case folders, a highlighted deed, and a calm that made Crane's performance look like what it was, a tantrum in a suit. Judge Halverson glanced through the packet with the energy of someone already regretting her docket. "Let me be clear," she said, peering over her glasses. "There is no legal ambiguity here. Ms. Ellis owns 50% of the property. That ownership is documented, unchallenged, and uncontested. If she wishes to sell her share, she may do so. The court will not interfere in a lawful real estate transaction because of hurt feelings." Crane objected. Briefly. Weakly. The judge shut it down in a sentence and adjourned without a sidebar. Outside the courtroom, Nathan looked stunned. His posture sagged, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't have a comeback ready. Margaret didn't even bother turning toward him as she walked out beside George, her heels clicking evenly against the tile like punctuation. By the time Nathan made it back to his car, his ears were burning and his temper was fraying. Charlotte was already texting him from the kitchen counter, her message frantic and furious. "We need to get ahead of this. Local press is going to catch wind. If they find out your mother is selling the house from under you, we'll be a laughingstock." A second message followed seconds later. "What if we say she's not well, that she's confused? There's no paper trail on any diagnosis, but we could float the idea. Just a little leak. It'll buy time." Paige had come downstairs quietly to grab her headphones from the charger when she stopped just short of the hallway. She heard Charlotte's voice low and sharp through the open archway. "She's erratic. She's always been proud, but now it's turned into something else. This whole thing, it feels manic, doesn't it?" Nathan's voice followed, more strained. "It wouldn't take much. If a journalist ran even a single line about mental decline, just one unnamed source." Paige stood frozen, her phone in her hand. Then she hit the record button. She didn't say anything. She didn't make a sound. She just captured the entire thing. That evening, while Charlotte was upstairs taking a bath and Nathan was in his office scouring financial documents he no longer controlled, Paige drove across town without asking permission. She pulled into Margaret's driveway just as dusk was settling over the rooftops. Inside, Margaret was folding laundry, soft old towels that had outlived their color but not their purpose. "I recorded them," Paige said, not waiting for hello. "They were planning to tell the press you're senile, that you're unstable, to block the sale." Margaret set down the towel she was holding and looked at her granddaughter for a long moment, first with surprise, then something closer to quiet pride. "Are you sure you want to be part of this?" she asked. "I already am," Paige said. "You're the only one who hasn't tried to use me like a chess piece." George came by an hour later after Margaret forwarded him the file. His face was grim but efficient. "We'll file a preemptive protection order. Slander, coercion, defamation. Nothing theatrical, just enough to make it hurt if they try anything." By the next morning, George had it filed and stamped. That afternoon, Helen brought over a fresh loaf of sourdough and 2 glasses of boxed wine. "They tried to leak a smear campaign," she said, half laughing as she poured. "Lord, they're unraveling faster than a cheap apron string." Margaret clinked her glass lightly against Helen's. "And they're still convinced I'll patch it back up for them." The air that Saturday morning was crisp in a way Charleston rarely allowed, a coastal breeze with enough bite to sweep the humidity off the sidewalks. Margaret arrived at Willow Sound Lane at precisely 9:48 a.m., wearing gray slacks, a tailored blouse, and a small gold brooch that had belonged to her mother. She parked 3 houses down, walked the rest of the way with her handbag looped over one arm, and smiled as she passed the florist's van pulling up behind her. Inside the house, the scent of lavender candles was already thick in the air. Charlotte's voice floated out from the kitchen, clipped and organized. "Shrimp on the right platter, not the left. No, we're not doing oysters, Sandra, we talked about that." Margaret let herself in through the side gate, where the buyer's agent was already waiting by the back patio, with a clipboard and a canvas bag full of glossy one-pagers. He looked calm, professional, exactly the kind of man who knew how to sell homes without stirring conflict. "You ready?" he asked. "I've been ready," Margaret said. By 10:03 a.m., the first potential buyers began to arrive, some in couples, some alone, one with a toddler gripping a juice box and pointing at the koi pond through the fence. They stepped through the gate, admired the view, commented on the marble patio and custom pergola as the agent guided them quietly through the backyard and toward the French doors leading into the living room. At 10:11, the catering van pulled into the driveway. Charlotte came outside in heels and pearls, her phone clutched tightly in one hand. The sight of strangers admiring her hydrangeas made her stop cold. "What the hell is going on?" she snapped, her voice carrying across the lawn like a snapped violin string. Margaret turned from the lemonade pitcher she'd just set on a tray. "Just showing the house," she said calmly. "While it's still partly mine." Charlotte's mouth opened, then closed. She turned to Sandra, the event planner, who was frozen mid-tablecloth spread. "Is this a joke? Are you seeing this?" Sandra blinked, unsure if she was part of a prank or a crisis. And then Nathan appeared. He stormed through the French doors, blazer half on, shirt untucked, face already red with exertion. "What is this?" he shouted. "Mom, are you out of your damn mind?" "Good morning, Nathan," Margaret said, nodding toward the young couple admiring the kitchen island. "We've had 7 walkthroughs already. Lovely turnout." "You brought strangers into my home during a charity event?" Margaret poured 2 glasses of lemonade and handed one to the couple, who smiled, slightly uncomfortable but curious. "Well, it's still my home, too," she replied, her tone light but unshakable. "And your wife should have checked the calendar. I've had this on the books for 2 weeks. "Cancel it," Nathan barked. "Right now." "I'd need to consult the agent," Margaret said, gesturing toward the clipboarded man who was now deep in conversation with a prospective buyer over square footage and school districts. "But I wouldn't recommend interrupting a cash offer." Charlotte stood on the patio steps, stunned into silence as more guests wandered past her, politely nodding and slipping off their shoes before entering the sunroom. Nathan turned in a slow circle, mouth open, looking like he was trying to wake from a dream no one else seemed to be in. "You are humiliating me," he hissed under his breath, but loud enough for the guests closest to the patio to hear. "You're ruining our lives over a joke." Margaret tilted her head. "Oh, honey, this isn't the joke." She turned back to the table, picked up the last clean glass, and poured herself a lemonade. Across the yard, Paige appeared near the side fence, arms folded, watching everything unfold like someone finally seeing a magician's trick from behind the curtain. She didn't wave. She didn't flinch. She just stayed. The headline dropped on a Tuesday morning like a brick through a glass window. "Charleston millionaire faces home sale by own mother. Property dispute exposes deep family rift." The Post and Courier ran it above the fold with a photo of the house's exterior, golden morning light casting soft shadows across the manicured lawn, the kind of image that should have belonged in a lifestyle magazine. But the article didn't focus on real estate. It focused on legacy. Sources close to the situation confirmed that Margaret Ellis, 71, a retired housekeeper and co-title holder of the Willow Sound Lane estate, initiated a partial sale of the multi-million-dollar property after a Mother's Day gift sparked controversy inside the family. The gift, a maid's uniform, was interpreted by Ellis as a demeaning gesture, despite claims from her son, tech entrepreneur Nathan Ellis, that it was meant playfully. The word playfully was in quotes. The rest of the article was clinical in tone but razor-sharp in its subtext. It detailed Margaret's financial contributions to the home, her decades of labor and quiet sacrifice, and, most damning of all, the text exchange and attempted smear campaign that Margaret's legal team had declined to comment on, though the protection order was now a matter of public record. Helen brought the paper over mid-morning, still warm from the corner newsstand. She plopped it down on Margaret's kitchen table like she was delivering a fresh pie. "You're on page 1, she said, pulling out a chair. "People are calling you a folk hero." Margaret didn't laugh, but her eyes lifted slightly. "I'm just a mother with equity." Helen poured them each a glass of iced tea from the pitcher in the fridge. "You gave him roots and he tried to hand you a broom," she muttered. "Now you've given him headlines." The phone started ringing not long after. Landlines and mobiles, reporters, talk shows, a few people from Margaret's old neighborhood just calling to say we saw, and we're proud of you. Someone left flowers on her porch, sunflowers and red zinnias in a brown paper wrap, no note. By late afternoon, Paige sent a text from school. "Paige, kids in AP government are arguing about you. Half the room thinks you're an icon. The other half just wants to know if you're on TikTok." Margaret smiled at the message, then set her phone face down beside the sink. She had just pulled a pan of cornbread from the oven and didn't want to let it cool unevenly. Over in the gated sanctuary of Willow Sound Lane, Charlotte's reaction was less composed. Her social media went private by noon. A charity partner dropped her name from a planning committee out of sensitivity to recent headlines. Several emails went unanswered. A yoga instructor canceled their weekly private session, citing reputational strain. That evening, Nathan sat in his study, blinds drawn, staring at his phone like it might turn off if he glared at it hard enough. The group chat with Margaret had gone completely dark. Even Paige hadn't responded to his last 2 messages. The narrative had shifted, and not in the direction he could afford. Meanwhile, Margaret was back on her porch, feet tucked under her, sipping tea while Helen read sections of the article aloud like it was scripture. In an age where generational wealth often assumes silent obedience from those who built its foundations, Margaret Ellis's decision to sell her half of the estate has opened conversations across the region about inheritance, dignity, and maternal power. "Damn," Helen muttered, lowering the paper. "They're writing about you like you're an institution." Margaret exhaled through her nose, slow and careful. "Maybe I am," she said. "Or maybe I'm just what happens when a woman finally uses the full square footage of her name." The request came through George's office late on a Thursday afternoon, disguised as civility. A brief email from Crane, formal and polished, asking if Margaret might be willing to meet privately. No lawyers, no press, just a final family conversation. George read the message aloud with his reading glasses pushed low on his nose, and Margaret said yes before he finished the sentence. "Just don't expect sincerity to arrive wearing a tie," she'd said. They met at George's office 2 days later, in a room lined with law books and sunlight. Nathan arrived alone. No Crane, no Charlotte, no folder full of objections, just him, in a charcoal blazer and an expression trying to impersonate humility. He looked thinner than the last time Margaret had seen him, sharper around the cheekbones, eyes darting too much, like someone who'd gotten used to living in a house with blinds permanently drawn. George remained in the room, sitting at the far corner of the table, silent but not neutral. His presence, like oak, there whether you needed it or not. Nathan cleared his throat and started with an apology, though it barely cleared the floor. "I just want this to end quietly," he said. "No more drama, no more articles, no more people treating me like I'm the villain in some Southern Gothic." Margaret listened without blinking. "I'm offering to buy you out," he continued, sliding a folded document across the table. "It's 20% under appraisal, but it's fast, clean. No court battles, no media mess. I'll wire the money today." She didn't reach for the paper. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough for the silence to stretch between them like a drawn curtain. Then she reached into her handbag and pulled out a sealed plastic envelope. Inside was the Maid uniform, neatly pressed, with the note still tucked inside the collar like a rotted heart in a spotless body. She slid it across the table toward him. "Return to sender," she said, "and try again. This time, bring your respect." Nathan didn't move. His hand twitched once, but he didn't touch the envelope. George leaned forward slightly. "Her half of the home is currently valued at $4.78 million. Add interest on the 10 years she carried it without payment or acknowledgement, and we're closer to $5.6 million. You have 2 options, Nathan, cash or court." Nathan's jaw worked in silence like he was trying to chew something bitter that wouldn't go down. The air in the room grew still. Then the door opened quietly and Paige stepped in. She hadn't announced she was coming, but George had sent her the address. Margaret looked up at her granddaughter, who offered a small nod before sitting beside her without hesitation. Nathan blinked. "Paige, this is not—" "If you weren't my dad," she said, "I'd cheer her out loud." The words landed without drama, flat and final. Nathan looked at her like she'd hit him, like the last scaffolding of entitlement had finally cracked beneath his feet. "You can call it business, Dad," Paige added, "but it stopped being that the minute you made it personal." He turned to Margaret again, this time without posturing. "You're really going to go through with this?" Margaret placed her hands calmly on the table, palms down, steady as stone. I went through with it the moment you taught me the cost of staying silent. The wire cleared at 9:31 a.m. on a Wednesday. George confirmed it with a short call, nothing theatrical, just a clipped, "Funds are in, you're liquid, Margaret." She'd nodded, said thank you, and ended the call before the dial tone could catch up. Her hands didn't shake, not even a little. The sale had closed. She was no longer a co-owner of 117 Willow Sound Lane. She was its former investor, its invisible scaffolding, and now its paid architect of departure. The moving truck arrived before noon. The crew wore navy uniforms with stitched names and polite smiles. They took instruction well. Margaret directed them only once, asking that her framed photographs be packed together, gently, and that nothing be loaded until she'd had a final walkthrough. She moved through the rooms without rush or sentimentality. The house looked smaller now, not in square footage, but in grandeur. She could still remember laying grout in the downstairs bathroom herself when Nathan couldn't afford a contractor. She remembered picking out the pantry shelves from a resale warehouse to save $20. None of that was visible now, just marble, glass, and soft lighting trying to conceal the fact that some legacies are rented more than they're earned. Near the front door, she placed the small framed message she'd brought from her own living room. It was oak, polished, and propped upright on the console table. To the woman who cleaned homes until she owned one, and the son who never understood the difference. She didn't tape it down, didn't announce it, just left it standing. By 12:47, Charlotte arrived. The brunch planning meeting had been canceled. The realtor had stopped returning calls. She looked tired. Not in a way that could be fixed with concealer, but in the way someone looks when the scaffolding of social rank starts to tilt in the wind. Her heels clicked toward the foyer. Then she saw the frame. For a full 5 seconds, she didn't move. Then, with a sudden twist of her arm, she snatched the frame off the table and yanked it from the stand. "This is disgusting," she muttered, almost to herself. "It's petty." Paige had just walked in through the side entry. She stood still for a moment, then walked over, took the frame gently from Charlotte's hands, and didn't say a word. She just tucked it under her arm like something fragile and sacred. Then she turned and left again without meeting either of their eyes. By sunset, Margaret was sitting on the porch of her new home, a modest cottage tucked behind a row of crepe myrtles, barely a 15-minute drive from Willow Sound. The porch wrapped around both sides like an embrace. It wasn't large, but it was hers outright. No cosigners, no favors, no footnotes. The mailbox already had her name on it in clean black lettering, M. Ellis. No middle initials, no need. A neighbor from 2 doors down brought over a peach cobbler in a ceramic dish she said could be returned whenever, which meant never. Another neighbor left a small bouquet of zinnias with a card that read, "Saw you in the paper. You deserve peace." Margaret hadn't met her yet. Helen arrived just after 6, clutching a paper bag with 2 bottles of cider and a deck of cards they'd never once used, but kept bringing to each other's houses like a running joke. They sat on the porch swing, rocking gently as the first streetlight buzzed on down the lane. "So," Helen said, sipping from the bottle, "you sold his house. How do you feel?" Margaret leaned back against the cushion and let the silence breathe for a few seconds before answering. "I feel located," she said finally. "Like I've been in the right place all along, just waiting for the deed to catch up." The cottage smelled of sage, butter, and slow forgiveness. It was Thanksgiving, and the oven's warmth pressed gently against the windows while soft jazz drifted from the old radio on the counter. The day had unfolded without ceremony. No formal plan, no timeline, just 2 women moving at their own pace, slicing, stirring, seasoning, passing recipes between memory and instinct. Margaret wore her mother's apron, the one with the faded apple print that barely clung to the edges anymore. Paige wore sweatpants and a borrowed cardigan, her hair twisted into a loose bun, barefaced and unhurried. They had the whole day to themselves, and they used it. The turkey was small, barely 10 pounds, but basted with quiet joy. They made mashed potatoes from scratch, roasted carrots with honey and thyme, and baked a pie that neither of them particularly needed but couldn't imagine skipping. Every dish felt like a reclamation, not of a tradition exactly, but of space, of permission. They laughed more than either expected, at Margaret's crooked pie crust, at the way Paige couldn't remember whether the cranberry sauce was supposed to boil or simmer, at how the green beans went cold twice because they kept pausing to tell stories. Sometime after lunch but before dessert, Margaret brought out a faded blue box from the hallway linen closet. "I figured," she said, "if we're doing the full holiday, we might as well include the ghosts." Inside were photo albums, heavy, textured, and stuffed past their seams. Paige curled up on the floor with a blanket while Margaret sat on the couch above her, sipping tea as her granddaughter flipped page after page. There were black and white photos of Margaret as a child, her hair pressed into tight curls, standing outside a farmhouse with a dish towel in her hand. There were wedding pictures of her and Frank, faces younger than Paige had ever imagined. A shot of baby Nathan in a kiddie pool, his chubby legs kicking under the sun. "Did you always save everything?" Paige asked, gently peeling back a corner that had stuck to the page. "I saved what mattered," Margaret said. "I didn't always know what that would be, but I knew I'd want proof later." They stopped on a photo of Paige at 5 years old, sitting in Margaret's lap with a juice box in one hand and glitter glue smeared across her cheek. "I remember that day," Paige whispered, smiling. "You let me ruin your coffee table." "I let you live in your own skin," Margaret said, reaching over to brush a strand of hair from her face. "And I always will." She let the words settle before adding, softly but firmly, "You'll never wear someone else's label. Not under my roof." The radio hummed behind them. The kettle hissed softly on the stove. Outside, the sun lowered over the marsh, painting gold onto everything it touched. Then Paige's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Her face went flat. She held it out so Margaret could read it. "Nathan, hope you're having fun in the shack." Margaret didn't react right away. She reached for the teacup, took a sip, and placed it back on the saucer with quiet precision. Paige stared at the message a second longer, then tapped twice. Blocked. She placed the phone face down beside the pie plate and leaned her head against Margaret's knee. "This house may be small," Margaret said quietly, "but it knows who belongs here." Paige closed her eyes and nodded. They sat like that, the warmth of the cottage closing around them, while outside, the tide rolled in unnoticed and the wind moved softly through the porch rails. The soil was loose that morning, damp from an overnight drizzle that had broken just before dawn. Margaret knelt at the edge of her wraparound porch with gardening gloves tugged tight and a small canvas apron tied around her waist. Beside her sat a wooden crate filled with lavender starters, tomato vines, and a dozen tulip bulbs wrapped in newspaper. She wasn't planting for aesthetics. She was planting for legacy. The dirt welcomed each new addition like it had been waiting. She worked slowly, hands steady, mind quiet. The tulips went in first, her mother's favorite, lavender next, along the porch line to keep mosquitoes away and memory close, and finally the tomatoes, planted with enough room to climb. A hand-painted sign staked in the corner read, "Back to her roots." Paige had helped her letter it the night before, dipping the brush in careful strokes while Margaret sipped tea and pretended not to tear up. By late morning, Margaret had moved to the porch steps, wiping her hands on a towel when a familiar pickup rolled down the lane. It pulled into the driveway and stopped with the same mechanical sigh it always made. George stepped out, still in his court shoes, but with no briefcase. He held a folder under one arm and a smile that gave nothing away. "Retired," he said as he climbed the steps. Margaret raised a brow. "Really?" "Effective this morning. I'm not billing you for this visit, so don't make me regret it." He handed her the folder. Inside was a deed, not to her current home, but to a modest cabin upstate he'd inherited from an uncle and never found time to use. "In case," he said, "you want more land to own." Margaret stared at the document a long moment, then closed the folder and set it on her lap. "I might just name that one Aftershock," she said. George grinned. "That's poetic. A second act for seismic women." After he left, Margaret went back inside and wrote a check to the local community college, an unrestricted donation designated for working mothers returning to school. It wasn't enormous, but it was clean and quiet, and hers. She folded the receipt into a drawer near the stove, beneath old recipes and a photograph of herself in her 20s, holding baby Nathan in a threadbare rocking chair. That afternoon, Paige arrived carrying a poster board sealed in protective wrap. "It's for school," she said, almost shyly. "We had to create something about power." She unwrapped the board and leaned it against the porch rail. The title read, "The Woman Who Bought Herself Back." It was a collage, part illustration, part photo transfer, part stitched fabric. It showed a silhouette of a woman planting seeds while skyscrapers loomed behind her. But the flowers grew taller than the buildings. On the bottom corner was a photo of Margaret, cut from the newspaper, holding a glass of lemonade in front of Willow Sound Lane. Margaret didn't speak at first. Then, quietly, "It's stunning." Paige sat beside her. "So are you." The wind picked up, rustling the young lavender, tilting the porch chimes just enough to make them sing. They sat together without needing to speak, watching the garden take root. And after a long, slow minute, Margaret said what she'd never said to anyone, not even herself. "He gave me a uniform," she said. She looked out across the flower beds and smiled. "I gave myself the title, owner.